I think back in the day when Thatcher was first elected leader of the opposition, she put out a speech. She did a talk. I think it was an interview, and she said, nations that have pursued equality, like the Iron Curtain countries, I think have finished up with neither equality nor liberty. Nations which, like us in the past, have pursued liberty as a fundamental objective, extending it to all, have finished up with liberty, human dignity, and far fewer inequalities than others. Liberty is fundamental. Liberty, human dignity, a higher standard of living is fundamental. And steadily, I think people are beginning to realize that you don't have those things unless you have a pretty large private enterprise sector. Now, dependent on those people producing these goods are a lot of others in the public sector. Now, if you run up the public sector, you can only do it by draining money out of industry and commerce. But that's where the jobs are. And one of the reasons why you have to cut public expenditure is to get the money back. One of the reasons why you have to cut public expenditure is to get money back out of the public sector and into industry and commerce, so that they, in fact, can invest and improve and expand, because that's where the secure jobs are. Now, of course, you may not agree with Thatcher's pivot about the value of knocking back the public sector in order to boost the private sector, in order to drip down into that sort of drip down effect. You may think that's wrong, but I think fundamentally what she says about liberty is absolutely right, and no one can question that. So she talks about equality in the Iron Curtain countries. Now, I've been in the Iron Curtain countries, and I saw what equality meant. I saw what equality meant in Albania before it became a democracy. I saw what equality meant in Russia, in Moscow, after it became a democracy, as Putin's power gripped the nation. It's not liberty. And the direction of Russia now, there are people in the newspapers screaming with enthusiasm about the possibility of the return of the USSR. This is extraordinary. It's not equality and it's not liberty. So if you're looking for liberty, then other things follow. That's what Thatcher is saying. And so to tighten up the screws on liberty is to destroy all the organs of a proper democracy. To focus on equality and to define equality as the lowest common denominator, to bring everybody down to a common base, whether this is in education or in legal rights, it doesn't really make too much difference. That is the Iron Curtain approach to civilization, and it isn't civilized, it isn't democratic, and it doesn't produce freedom. And while Thatcher's approach may be questionable, to boost private sector in the hope that private sector will then invest in public service and produce great cities like Manchester and Birmingham, as they did in the 19th century, it doesn't detract from her observation that pursuing equality is oppressive. Pursuing liberty can be efficacious. To destroy liberty is always damaging. The eradication of the right to protest in the UK is a cautionary tale of democratic deceit and decline marked by legislative overreach under the Conservative government and Labour's subsequent inertia. And it doesn't seem to matter to me, as far as I can see, that someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, in an article today, talks about, well, initially he talks about Thomas More, St. Thomas More, who was found guilty of treason and took the opportunity, I'm now quoting, to speak and set out his position that there were certain things that Parliament simply could not legislate for. And one of those was that it couldn't overrule God's law. And Rees-Mogg says this is a compelling argument which must be true in an absolute sense, but is nonetheless not true in a constitutional sense. So in other words, what he says, because Thomas More was executed, and because the King, Charles I, was executed, although the King is technically above the law and God, Parliament cannot legislate against God's law, in practice it can. I think that distinction is something that Rees-Mogg sort of tries to avoid making explicitly. And he then talks about the 1972 European Communities Act and the Human Rights Act and why he dislikes those because they have power over Parliament. But the whole point is that in principle, so does God. In principle, so does the monarch. It's just in practice, Parliament can legislate against the laws it doesn't like, as, for example, legislating in favour of the Rwanda Act, which is an absurdity. And what we have to do is to recognise, yes, Parliament has absolute power, but that should be constrained by ethical prudence. And reducing our liberty is not an ethical prudence. Human Rights Watch 2025 World Report sharply criticises the UK for seriously undermining democratic rights, and particularly the right to peaceful protest, once a cornerstone of civic engagement. Now, I personally don't think that marching in the street is remotely efficacious. I think it's a waste of time, and I think we've got much better tools at our disposal. But equally, I don't think it's right to eradicate this right to march. If people want to march, they should. And the Conservatives under Priti Patel and Suella Braverman introduced two acts of Parliament which should have been repealed, and both have not. One, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022, and two, the Public Order Act 2023, ostensibly to address disruptive protests. And key measures include police powers to limit protests based on noise or serious disruption, which is a nonsense, because the whole idea of protest is about making noise. The creation of offences like locking on and obstructing infrastructure, and granting police stop and search powers without suspicion, which again erodes basic liberty. Thatcher said that liberty was the cornerstone of our democracy. And I'm inclined to agree with that. Liberty is the key. And once we start playing around with liberty, we are playing around with the basis of political life. While these measures targeted groups like Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, they disproportionately curtailed broader civil liberties. Critics, including the UN, have argued that these laws criminalise peaceful dissent and they tarnish the UK's reputation as a democracy. Keir Starmer's government inherited this draconian framework in July 2024, with expectations of reform amplified by Starmer's human rights background. Yet Labour has not only failed to repeal these laws, but has continued to appeal court rulings that challenge their legality. And this reluctance to get rid of these bad laws signals tacit approval over policing dissent, as evidenced by harsh sentences for climate activists and mass surveillance at protests. Labour's inaction underscores a broader failure to reclaim democratic principles. It suggests a political calculus prioritising law and order optics over civil liberties, mirroring authoritarian trends worldwide. From the UN's condemnation of facial recognition at protests to Human Rights Watch's denouncement of these laws as deeply troubling, global observers question the UK's commitment to democratic norms, and domestically groups like Liberty and Netpol warn of a chilling effect on activism, particularly targeting climate and pro-Palestine movements. The suppression of protest rights reflects a deeper failure of government. It dovetails with xenophobic policies, hate speech, and the cost of living crisis, creating fertile ground for authoritarian rhetoric and, effectively, the beginnings of tyranny. Labour's continuation of Conservative-era policies betrays the trust of voters who anticipated progressive reform. And repealing these anti-protest laws must be a priority for Labour if it's to preserve the UK's democratic ethos. As Liberty's Akiko Hart says, a democracy that punishes peaceful dissent ceases to be a democracy. The UK needs to decide, does it defend freedom of assembly or continue down a path where dissent becomes a criminal act? Without reform, Britain risks losing its moral authority at home and abroad.